Certainly sharing for me.
Fantastic, thank you. That's great. Well, thanks ever so much. And thank you everyone for being here today. It's an opportunity for us just to talk through the projects that we're hoping to run as a centre in 2024 and 2025, and for us to seek applications from people who might want to host those projects with us. So I'll run through some slides which provide some practical information, and then there'll be plenty of time afterwards to ask any questions that might be about the process generally or might be about some specific queries. Laura will be keeping an eye on the chat, and it's fine to put questions in the chat as well, and we can go around via hands after the presentation as well. If there's anything that's very specific to your organisation or to your service or your system, and you want to drop us a line direct to explore it with us, then please do. My email is j.glasby@bham.ac.uk, and BHAM is short for Birmingham. We can put that in the chat in the moment, but it'd be fine to drop me a line as well if you wanted to talk about something direct that you didn't want to talk about on the call with everybody else. So just really briefly, in case you're fairly new to Impact, for improving adult care together, and it's a £15 million centre funded by two national funders, the Economic and Social Research Council and the Health Foundation, between 2021 and 2027. It's the UK Centre for Implementing Evidence in Adult Social Care. And so it works all over the country in each of the four nations and sharing lessons across those boundaries to try and implement evidence of what works in the reality of local services and the reality of people's lives. And when we talk about evidence of what works, we mean insights from different types of research. We mean insights from the lived experience of people who draw on care and support or who are carers. And we mean insights from the practice knowledge of people who work in social care. And we'd see those three ways of knowing the world, research, lived experience and practice knowledge, as all really important in their own right. And as part of establishing what works, or what might be promising or fruitful for us all to pursue, we try and bring together insights from those different types of knowledge in order to try and make a difference on the ground. The centre as a whole is led by 14 academic policy and practice partners across different parts of the are based at the University of Birmingham, but including people who have lived experience of drawing on care and support, carers organisations and organisations that represent different parts of the social care workforce. And we have four delivery models: our demonstrators, our networks, our facilitators, and our Ask Impact service, which I'll explain in the next slide. And crucially, we try and work in the reality of local practice, the reality of local services, but then we try and take a step back to think through what we've learned about that issue. And we try to find ways to influence national policy and practice in each of the four nations of the UK. We call that national embedding, but it's a way that we can be greater than the sum of our parts. So rather than trying to share learning and scale innovation just by telling people about it, we also try to embed it in the way that social care gets done in those four different nations, whether that's through the work of some of the service regulators, some of the educational bodies, through policymakers, through relationships with other national organisations and intermediary bodies, a concept of national embedding, which helps the centre to be greater than the sum of its individual parts. We've got four key aims. The first is around increasing use of evidence to improve practice and outcomes. But in the process, we seek to build capacity and skills in the workforce with evidence, to develop relationships between the broad range of stakeholders involved in adult social care in what can sometimes be a very fragmented sector. And then again, in the process, trying to improve understanding of what helps and what hinders when it comes to implementing evidence in practice. And you'll find more details on our website, but these are our four delivery models with some of the pilot projects that we ran in 2022 to 23, and then the projects that we're currently running in 2023 to 24. Now that we're into our main delivery period. The first of those is our impact demonstrators, and those are quite large strategic change initiatives. And with our demonstrators, a pair of strategic coaches work in a local service or system to support quite a large strategic evidence-informed change. Between them, the pair would bring a mix of skills and experience in terms of change management and organisational development, but also in terms of practice knowledge and lived experience. And our pilot in 2022 was in Mid and East Antrim in Northern Ireland, looking at asset-based approaches in services for older people. We're now working in several sites across the UK. We have one demonstrator around creating integrated neighbourhood teams, and that's got staff working in Leeds, in Carnarvon and in East Ayrshire. We've got a project across the whole of Scotland looking at improving the well-being of personal assistants, and then a project across the whole of the East Midlands of England that's looking at co-producing new ways to manage waiting lists in adult social care. So they tend to be quite big, quite meaty topics, quite whole system. And the coaches support that local evidence-informed change, facilitate and support it. They also help the local system to carry out an evaluation of what's possible to achieve or not by working in that kind of way. And then they work to influence national policy and practice. In contrast, our facilitators work on perhaps more bounded, more single organisation, slightly more bottom-up evidence-informed change projects. Our pilots last year looked at increasing direct payments for people from Black and minority ethnic communities in Leicester, support for carers of people at end of life in Hospice of the Valleys and Ebbw Vale, and use of technology in home care, working with an agency in Glasgow. And then this year, our facilitators will be looking at reducing loneliness for people in rural areas in Elgin, running preventative visits to help older people plan ahead for future needs in County Armagh, ways to recruit more men into social care, working with a provider partner in London, and the project in Caerphilly that we're just recruiting to at the moment to reduce admissions to mental health hospitals through more community-based approaches to supporting people with mental health problems. For complex but everyday practice issues, our impact networks, they're groups of local people with a local chair or a convener. They're usually made up of people who draw on care and support, carers, practitioners and managers. And those local groups work all over the UK, but all focusing on the same practical issue in their local area. They get some stimulus material from us to sum off, and then they go through quite a structured way of meeting and feeding back over a 6-month period what they did in response to the evidence, what barriers got in the way, how they tried to get around them, what they plan to do next. And after each meeting, that learning is collated centrally and then sent back out, so that the local group is doing the work in its own local area in a way that makes sense for them. But at the same time, the learning is being shared and scaled across the whole of the UK. And our networks will typically have members in each of the 4 nations at any one time. So last year, our 2 pilot networks focused on choice and control in services for people with mental health problems or learning disabilities. That focused in particular on mechanisms like individual service funds or managed budgets, or perhaps more cooperative models in a Wales context. And then the second pilot was around values-based recruitment in social care. And then this year, we'll have 6 impact networks looking at the health and wellbeing of care workers, rural social care, hospital discharge and older people, care homes and the relationships that they build with residents and with local communities, people with learning disabilities and autistic people leaving long stay hospitals. And then finally, one that we've called remodeling the front door, which is really about local authorities who are trying to develop more preventative, more asset-based ways of working with local communities, and who reach a tipping point when they want to change how they engage with people and how people contact them in the first place. We've called that remodeling the front door. And then finally, our Ask Impact team reviews the evidence on a series of hot topics in adult social care, and it produces some rigorous but very practical and accessible guides to help people understand insights from the evidence. Our first guide was around recruiting and retaining staff in social care, and our next 2 guides will be about hospital discharge and older people, and about some of the lessons that we learned during COVID about how to manage change. So those are our 4 models: demonstrators, facilitators, networks, and Ask Impact. And the call for applications focuses on our demonstrators, our facilitators, and our networks, the models where we recruit and work with a local service or site or system. Ask Impact is a more of a desk-based model that reviews the evidence and finds really accessible ways to make that available to people. So in terms of hosting a future impact project, we've launched the national application process to try and identify the sites that will work with us in 2024, 2025, starting from around September 2024. The application needs some local preparation, coming to the session today, talking to partners and so on, but the actual process itself is very, very light touch. We didn't want that to be a barrier to people applying, and we didn't want to waste people's time when everyone is so busy and under so much pressure by having a very onerous process. November, there's full details on the impact website with all the materials that I'm talking through today, and also a recording of a session like this one that we did in October. If you want to watch anything back or remind yourself about anything that we've covered today. We're also really happy to book one-to-one calls if people want to discuss ideas or opportunities further with us, or if there's something they want to explore without doing it in a group when we've got Q&A in a moment. We're looking for a very wide range of organisations, all types and all sizes, and from locations across the UK. We'd particularly welcome applications from organisations that might not usually come forward, maybe community and user-led organisations, perhaps small organisations. There may be some organisations that are struggling a little bit at the moment and you know, would normally find it difficult to submit an application, but might actually really benefit from the support were that application to be successful. So please consider applying. On the website, we then run through a series of topics, a long list of topics that we're interested in working on in 2024 and 2025. And we suggest a potential delivery model that we think might work best for each topic. So in terms of potential demonstrators, the list is on the website and it's on the slide now, but I'll just run through them really quickly. One was around involving people with lived experience in strategic commissioning. We've seen lots of examples of involving people in discussions about their own care and involving in relatively small scale service design, but it seems rarer to involve people in a really systematic way in very strategic commissioning. And people who draw on care and support, who are part of Impact's governance, have fed back to us that a number of people's lives are really difficult at the moment, and that there seems to be a real gap between the reality of some people's lives and some of our very senior decision making. And so the more that we could all do together to get co-production into those strategic spaces, the better the opportunity that services and support match the nature of the needs that there are out there. We'd be interested in a demonstrator around how you rebalance services that have often been quite crisis focused towards something that's more preventative and that focuses more on community-based support and early intervention. Again, there are lots of pilot projects, but how do you do that more strategically, almost more systematically in a local area? We'd love to run a project about transition between children's and adult services. Impact focuses on adult social care in its own right, but it's really conscious of the interfaces with sectors like health and housing, for example, and also the need for whole family approaches and the recognition of the importance of the relationship between children's and adult services. There's a possibility to have a demonstrator around changing public perceptions of social care and raising its profile. Movements like Social Care Future have been really active here, and the recent House of Lords Adult Social Care Committee, to which I was a special advisor actually, talked about the invisibility of adult social care and tried to identify ways in which we could increase the understanding and the prominence of social care, as well as increasing the extent to which we value it as a society. There'd be scope to have a project around improving day opportunities for people with learning disabilities, so that perhaps we move away from more building-based services into something that helps people lead more ordinary lives. There's a possibility of building on some research from a national funder called the National Institute for Health and Care Research around ways of organising social work with older people to free those social workers up to do what they're really good at and to do the things that make the biggest difference for older people. We've got new models of home care, maybe moving into something more outcomes focused and less focused on time and task. There's a possibility for a project around supporting more of a research culture in social care. There are some local authorities already doing that, but there'd be scope for it to be a different council that was coming to this afresh, for it to be a care provider, for it to be something like an occupational therapy team or service, for example. So scope to apply from all over the social care system. And then finally, we'd like to see a demonstrator around ways of reducing violence, discrimination and abuse that are sometimes experienced by social care staff. In terms of potential facilitators, we'd envisage a project potentially around supporting staff to deliver more compassionate care. We know it's really difficult to deliver dignified personal care to other people if you don't feel very supported yourself. We'd like a project around boosting employment for disabled people. There's possibility of joint working with housing, and there's on the website we suggest a number of different things that might encompass. The scope to think about support for people with dementia to remain living at home for as long as they want to. A possible facilitator around whole family approaches or more family group conferencing or open dialogue type approaches if people are familiar with some of those mechanisms. And then the possibility for a facilitator around ensuring that supported living is really enhancing choice and control for people. It isn't just a kind of care home with your own front door situation, but it's genuinely enhancing choice and control and maximising what's possible in that setting. And then finally, a possible facilitator around support for carers of people with mental health problems or carers of older people, where the nature of the relationship and the nature of people's needs might be slightly different to other aspects of being a carer in other service settings, to use the jargon. And then in terms of potential networks, we've identified a long list of topics that includes support for people who fund their own care, anti-racist practice, whether that's in terms of support for staff and or the way we deliver and design services. One around using technology to promote independence or to promote greater prevention. Possibility of a network around social care in coastal communities. And then also scope for a network around recovery-based approaches to mental health, where rather than focusing just on people's clinical symptoms, we focus on the outcomes that people themselves are trying to achieve and support people to lead chosen lifestyles. So recovery in the sense of what recovery means to me, rather than necessarily what recovery might mean to a clinician. And just as an aside, each of our networks tends to have around 5 local groups taking part, one in each of the 4 nations. So if you are applying for possible projects on possible topics, we could probably run one of many of those demonstrator topics and one of many of those facilitator topics. With our networks, we could recruit 4 or 5 or 6 services or systems all over the UK to each one. So there is kind of 5 times the chance of success, I guess, just in sort of practical, tactical terms, if I can call it that. The demonstrators and the facilitators, there tends to be 1 project per bullet point. With the networks, there's 4 or 5 or 6 local groups that could work on anti-racist practice together. Then another 4 or 5 groups that could work on social care in coastal communities. So that the networks are a really positive option to consider. Just in terms of what Impact provides, the sort of offer and the ask, if you like, for the demonstrators and the facilitators, we recruit and fund and we manage staff who are based in the local system or the local service. With our demonstrators, it's 2 strategic improvement coaches who are each 50% for 12 months. For our facilitators, it's 1 more junior facilitator who is 50% for 12 months. But those are recruited to work specifically in the local area. And it's one of the reasons why the next round of projects won't start till about September time, because we would identify the location of our projects through this process, scope up that project with the successful applicants, and then we would recruit staff to work in those areas. So the staff recruitment process depends on where the service is based. If we were doing this in Cornwall, we'd have a certain group of people apply for the role. If we were doing it in the Shetland Isles, we'd have a different group of people. So we need the location first, effectively. So Impact recruits, funds and manages those staff for demonstrators and facilitators. And each project has got a small additional budget to enable some additional participation of people whose voices are seldom heard. And then also to get lessons learned locally into national policy and practice. And when we're recruiting those demonstrator coaches or those facilitators, there's a national recruitment process for those members of staff, and they can be employed by one of our 5 lead universities. It's either Birmingham or Sheffield in England, and it's Cardiff, Stirling, and Ulster. But the roles are typically 12 months for 50% each, so they're also ideal in terms of exploring secondments, maybe from policy or practice. And one of our roles and remits is around building capacity in the workforce. And so having this opportunity for people to apply on a secondment basis, and then if they're successful to come out of a policy or practice role 50% of their time to work with us on one of these projects, then go back to their substantive role at the end, has been a really, really positive way of building relationships between research, policy and practice. And then also encouraging what we've called more hybrid roles, where people get experience of working across those traditional boundaries. And they end up with deeper and richer and broader CVs than might otherwise have been the case. So I'm jumping a long way ahead here, but were you to be successful with an application, we'd then be recruiting staff, a demonstrator or a facilitator to work in the local area. And there would be scope for local partners to be making information about those roles available to people in terms of possible secondment opportunities. That's tended not to work very well if you see somebody getting a role like that as a loss to the local system. That would just be impact nicking your staff. But where you've got someone who's really up and coming and who would really benefit from a development opportunity like this, and indeed who might not stay in the local system if they didn't have a way of stretching themselves, we've often found it's a really good way of helping to develop people and indeed to keep them for the long term. With our work, will often be a commissioner or an elected member or a senior manager who is just a local member of staff in your organisation, but they'd receive an honorarium from us to recognise the time contribution that they were making. And it's often people who are already doing work on the topic or already wanting to do work. So it's part of the day job, if you like, and the network gives some extra structure, some extra momentum, maybe a bit of extra discipline even, and then the opportunity to learn locally and to share that learning and then to learn from others in other parts of the UK. So Impact pays the honorarium to the local convener or coordinator. It can pay for any venue or refreshment costs, and it can support participation by paying for things like travel, replacement care, PA support, and so on, if those are barriers to people whose voices are seldom heard taking part. The Impact team also provides all the initial evidence and the briefing. It provides some training and support for local coordinators, and it shares learning across all the local groups. The Impact team also has some additional funding to try and influence national policy and practice afterwards. And they re-contact sites at a later date to check in on how things have gone since the network was meeting. And our experience is that a number of networks continue to meet over the longer term where it adds value, either working on the same topic or becoming more of a kind of standing forum, if you like, on behalf of the local system, so that their work together and their influence often outlasts the project itself. In my head, it's a bit like one of those learning sets that people do sometimes on management development or leadership development programs, where you're working with peers for the duration of the program. And then sometimes the program finishes and the group finishes because its purpose is complete. Other groups carry on meeting to provide practical and peer support for each other, for 10, 20 years after the original leadership development program. And so the scope for networks to do their work and then to stop and to be time limited, but our experience is that sometimes they want to carry on, which feels really, really positive. What people need to apply is fairly brief, actually, so that the host site agrees to provide some sort of desk or office space for the staff to be based when they're on site. It commits principles of co-production with people who draw on care and support and carers, and where feasible, to enabling staff to attend events. So recognizing that that's really difficult and it's got to be planned really carefully. If you're a big local authority and you've applied for a project around social work and older people, then actually trying to help us get as many social workers as possible along to a staff engagement event would be really helpful, as it were. So committing to principles of co-production, but also to enabling staff to attend events where that's feasible, and recognising that that's difficult for all of us and needs to be handled carefully. Applications need to tick a box to say that they've got senior support and commitment to the application going in. And people agree to the learning being shared as well. Now, we do that in a careful, sensitive way. There's no risk of reputational harm, we don't think, but we do share learning after the project. So the site learns loads from being involved in Impact, but we also then share that material with other people afterwards. And so that's just one of the conditions for applying. Then for our demonstrators, the local service or the system carries out an evaluation with some support from us, but it's the local system doing the evaluation. And then, as I said earlier, for networks, the actual local chairing of the group, bringing together the group, is carried out by a local manager or local leader, albeit with a small honorarium for us. And I suppose finally on this slide, we've learned from our pilot projects last year that timing is really important. It works best when you're definitely going to do something, so it's kind of real, but where there's some flexibility or some scope for some additional thinking about the design, or some scope to fill gaps, or some scope to take an initial innovation and scale it. So where it's late enough on in the process that something's definitely going to happen, but it's early enough in the process where things aren't too fixed in stone. Last year, we ran a process like this, which was really, really successful. We had 100 odd applications for our current projects. And some people were quite speculative, a small number of people. I'd love one day to do something about X, and that was perhaps a little bit too soon for us. And other people had got a really definite model that they were rolling out, next week. It was good to go. And in one sense, that was really inspiring to hear about, but it probably wasn't right to work with us because it was going to happen in a particular way anyway. So there's just something about us trying to get the timing right. Likely to go live from about September 24, as I said earlier. So early enough where it isn't too fixed in stone, but late enough where something's definitely going to happen, if that just helps to sort of narrow the parameters a little bit. And then if people want to find out any more about Impact generally, its projects, some of the staff involved, the latest news and so on, there's a monthly e-update that you can sign up to online. There's the Twitter details as well. And if you go to the front page of the Impact website, there's a button that you can click straight in front of you that takes you through to the application process for these 2024-25 projects, with all the information I've just covered now, and indeed with a recording of a previous session, a bit like this one, and with the slides and so on. And that runs through the topics, the offer, the ask, how to apply. You click to get to the application form and so on. So with that in mind, if it's okay, I will just pause at that point and I will stop sharing my screen. And Laura, I don't know if you've been able to keep an eye on the chat, but I'm guessing some questions may have come in as we were speaking, and maybe we could just start to run through those if that was helpful.
Yes, that's right. I've tried to answer as many as I can going through, but there was one just now from George, which is about if the emphasis is on adult care, does that rule out intergenerational projects that they may do?
So no, not necessarily. So we do try and focus on adult social care in its own right, but we recognise the interfaces with other sectors like health or like housing, and we recognise the interactions with services like children's, for example. So some of the projects are specifically on that interface, transition between children's and adults. Others are on whole family approaches. And one of our partners, who's a member of our broader consortium of policy and practice partners across the UK who support our work, focuses specifically on intergenerational working, actually. So if there's a particular kind of thing, George, that's of interest to you, it might be worth emailing afterwards and we could follow it up in more detail. But in principle, we'd be delighted to consider something like that, because if it was intergenerational by definition, it would also include some adults in it of some description. So it would be in scope, almost certainly by default. But we are also quite interested in things that test new ways of working, that flex boundaries, that kind of more fully respond to the reality of people's lives. And just as a private individual, I've never understood why we thought it was a sensible way of breaking down the world into children and adults, given that, you know, most of us interact, don't we, across different service categories. So no, definitely in scope, and drop us a line if it's helpful to follow up anything in more detail.
Thank you. And there's another one, I think it's a follow-up about the limits of the projects. So John Waters asks, is there an opportunity to cut across the themes? So the aspiration of employment for disabled links well with a day service improvement, for example.
Yeah, definitely. Those are a long list of topics that they're interested in. So there's a number of flexibilities. So first of all, you could, I think the system may ask you to tick one box, and it may allow you to also tick another. I can't remember, but if it only allows you to tick one box, it's definitely worth saying there's a little bit of narrative that you get to submit. So it's worth flagging the way in which you're combining topics. So no, that would be positively encouraged. And a number of them, you know, there's one around new models of home care, and there's one around supporting more people with dementia to stay living at home for longer, or one around joint working with housing. Well, you know, one application could speak to all those topics in one go, as an example, and indeed it could be intergenerational, going back to George's query. So there's plenty of flexibility to kind of work with what's there in the long list, and then also the scope to take those topics, which are quite broad, and then to give them your own twist. So to say, where I'm based in Birmingham, I'm particularly interested in whole family approaches, but I'm interested in, you know, X as a way of taking that forward. I'd like to apply with that particular lens to it as well. So hopefully those bullet points in the long list are there's enough of them to appeal to everybody on the call. The scope to combine them in different kind of ways in a way that would make sense for you, but there's also scope to interpret them in the way that it would work for you as well. Probably just a good example of that, when you look at the website, is the joint working with housing, and we list on the website 3 or 4 examples of ways in which you might think about taking that forward, giving housing is quite a broad catch-all heading, and you might have loads of other ideas as well. So I think work with the spirit of the long list, but don't be hidebound by it, would be my take.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. And Helen was also asking about the deadline. So she was asking, will there be opportunities to apply next year too, or is this the final opportunity? So I don't know if you want to add to my comments in the chat.
Yeah, so the deadline for this particular round is the 30th of November. I've got a feeling there may not be a time on the website, but I think we'll take close of play on the 30th as being the de facto cutoff. So in my head, that's about 5 p.m. We anticipate having a similar process about this time next year to recruit another set of projects. And Impact is fully funded up until the end of 2027. The aspiration of ourselves and of funders is that beyond the end of 2027, it becomes more of a permanent feature of the social care landscape, so that it lasts beyond its initial funding. But we know that come what may, we're funded until the end of 2027. So our projects tend to be for about 6 months long for our networks, and then about 12 months for our demonstrators and our facilitators. So we anticipate having this process to start in September 2024, then to have another process to start in September 25, and then to have another process to start in September 2026 as well. And we've had a number of people that were interested last time, but the timing wasn't quite right for them for whatever reason, and then are going to apply this time round and so on. So if you've got something good to go, bearing in mind, even if you were successful, the project probably wouldn't start until September 2024, then it'd be great to apply now, but it's not now or never. There will be other opportunities.
Fantastic, thank you. And another one from George he was asking, anything reviewing how co-production is work for all stakeholders? And I quickly mentioned the link to the possible demonstrator project, but I don't know whether you want to add to that.
Yes, I mean, that's a really good question. So in one sense, co-production is built into all the projects. We have lived experience on our staff, on our leadership team, built into our governance. All the delivery projects will be working with different groups of people who draw on care and support and carers, as well as frontline staff locally. So in terms of our practice, co-production, kind of runs throughout everything like a stick of rock. That topic on the long list around involving people in strategic commissioning, I guess, has got a particular focus on co-production and strategic engagement. And it could be all the people in a local area. It could be around a particular sort of user group in terms of the way that the service system categorizes people, or it could be a range of different groups of people. Equally, a lot of the other projects have got links to some of the principles of co-production built into them. I guess if you're developing recovery-based approaches in mental health, by definition, that's co-produced between the individual clinician and the person, who are more of a partnership of equals. But the project would also have to be run in a very co-productive way, given the nature of the topic, and so on and so forth. So the strategic involvement and co-production is quite a good example of one where we've been relatively clear that we're interested in co-production and kind of strategic engagement. But then if you were submitting an application under that heading in particular, there'd be quite a lot of flexibility about how you pitched it, what you included, what locally it drew on, and so on. So hopefully quite a good example of that clarity of the stuff we're interested in, but flexibility about doing it in a way that would work for applicants, if that makes sense.
Great stuff. And the final one I think I picked up on the chat is one from Michelle and Fiona, who's asking about the precise location of the project in Elgin, what the footprint was.
Yes, so that's working across the whole of Moray, and with the person based in a particular service setting. But if you're particularly interested, drop me a line outside and we could chat some more, or I could link you up to the worker, because we have a particular facilitator who's based in that system, and they're kind of linking across quite a broad hinterland. So if that's a particularly of interest to you, then we could link you to them directly. It is Moray wide. It's just the person happens to be based in Elgin, in terms of where the lead partner in the desk space was. So yeah, Michelle, if you just drop me a line direct, and we could chat further maybe.
Wonderful. I think that's about it that I've picked up from the chat. So please do chip in, anybody, if I've missed your question. That's definitely by accident, not by design. I don't know if there are any more questions that anybody wants to.
I could just see a couple about AI and
yes, sorry, they've
chatbot and so on.
updated.
So yeah, so we've got a possible network around use of technology, and I'm envisaging that a number of those applications might have a kind of AI dimension to them. We're not doing anything specifically in that space at the moment. Outside my impact role, actually in my day-to-day university role, I did a study recently looking at use of AI in adult social care, and we worked with NHS England and Digital Social Care to produce a kind of guide or sort of toolkit for local authorities and care providers thinking about use of AI or other forms of new and emerging technology in the future. But we haven't got anything specifically in that space at the moment. The best example I'd come across, just in case it's of interest, was a legal charity called Access Social Care that work in England, I think, to, if I've remembered that correctly, to support people to ensure that their legal care and support rights are met. And they have quite an innovative chatbot approach to try and support people through the early parts of articulating their potential legal queries or the issues that they're facing, and then can support quite a lot of people in a kind of fairly automated way, but then can tailor support to people who've got really complex needs. So we're not doing that, but if that's the kind of thing that you're interested in more generally, I'm no expert, but I just found the work that Access Social Care was doing just kind of really interesting as an example of what's possible. And I think Laura's put that in the chat. And then someone's just asked about individual or separate applications. So if it's okay, could you put separate applications in if you're interested in both a facilitator and a demonstrator, for example? There's some boxes to tick to say you've got senior commitment and that you recognise the importance of co-production and so on. But then there's a sort of 500-word box where you say, this is what we're doing, this is what we're interested in, this is why we'd like to take part, and this is how impact might benefit us. And if you split that between two, then effectively you've got 250 words for each. So you get to make half a case, as it were, whilst everyone else who's just bidding for one would get the full 500 words. So if you're interested in both a facilitator and a demonstrator, it's worth just putting in two. And the process is really light touch. It's effectively some boxes to tick and a sort of 500 word statement about the things that I've just mentioned. The hard bit is the getting your head around it and the kind of upfront conversation with partners before you're ready to apply. The actual process of applying is relatively straightforward. I'm just seeing some other things, Laura. Some people are in touch with Catherine Mackay, who's leads for one of our delivery models at Sterling, our Scottish partners. Other people got quite a lot to digest, but quite a few areas that they might be interested in. I think that's from PAMIS, colleagues in Scotland. And if I'm right, PAMIS did that really interesting work about hospital passports and supporting people as they went into people with learning disabilities, they went into hospital as well. So no, we'd be happy to talk further, Jenny, if there's things in particular when you've had a chance to digest and so on. Have you spotted anything else, Laura, in the chat?
I haven't actually, but if anybody wants to chip in either in the chat or coming into the meeting, that'd be great.
Okay, that sounds like we might have reached a sort of natural break. So if it's okay, colleagues, I'll pause us all and end them at the call in a moment. Thanks, Laura, for all your help as well. Rachel's just asked in the background about how many sites and how many projects actually. So we've got a little bit of flexibility. I think we can do, and I'm just going from memory here, I think we can do about 6 demonstrators, about 6 facilitators, and about a similar number of networks. But the networks, we can have about 5 local groups for each network. So 6 networks equals 6 times 5, i.e. 30 potential local groups taking part, as it were. If we got loads of really great applications for facilitators and fewer for demonstrators, we might end up with fewer demonstrators and more facilitators. So it's not quite set in stone. But to give you a flavour, it's probably those numbers. Yeah. So as I say, I'll call time. Thanks, Laura, for all your help. Thank you, colleagues, for being here. My email's j.glasby@bham.ac.uk, or there's details on the Impact website of a sort of generic email that you can contact. So if there's individual things that you want to follow up, questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, things that occur to you later in the week when you've been reflecting on it, like Jenny saying quite a bit to digest, please just have a think and get back to us. The deadline is the 30th. So in one sense, you know, there's a sort of deadline to be working towards, but we've still got a fair way to go. And it sounds from the chat like a number of you are in touch with various impact partners across different parts of the country already, which is fantastic. So thank you ever so much for being here today. Please stay in touch if you'd like to find out more. There's also scope just to go on the Impact website and to sign up for an e-update, which would tell you about kind of materials that were coming out of some of the projects that I've mentioned so far. And indeed, when we were going through this process again this time next year, it would launch the process for you as well. So it's worth probably just signing up on the Get Involved slot of the website if you're just generally interested in this kind of topic. But thank you ever so much. Really nice to meet everybody. Thanks for some great questions. Drop us a line if we can help in any way, and have a good rest of the week. Take care.
See you all. Bye-bye.